The wind whispers through the darkened streets of a medieval village, where ancient fears stir beneath the surface. Here, the night is not a time of rest, but of terror, of shadows creeping in the corners, of stories passed down from one generation to the next. These aren't just tales of monsters, demons, and witches. They are the truths of a world where the unknown is the greatest enemy, where each creak of the floorboard and howl in the distance could be a harbinger of doom. In this world, darkness is more than the absence of light. It is a space where fear lives, where the boundary between the living and the supernatural is fragile, and where the night feels as though it could reach out and claim you at any moment. The darkness that settles over medieval Europe is unlike any other. Imagine the pale glow of the moon stretching over a forgotten village, where the air is heavy with the weight of untold stories. On quiet nights, long after the last embers of the hearth have died, the wind whispers of ancient fears. These are not just tales from the past, but haunting echoes from a time when life was shadowed by fear, superstition, and ever-present uncertainty. For the people of medieval Europe, the night was not a peaceful respite, but a terrifying stretch of endless unknowns. One can almost hear the creaking of ancient wooden doors, the subtle rustle of leaves outside the window, the eerie silence that fills the rooms as the sun dips below the horizon. Darkness meant something more in those days. It was not simply the absence of light, but a threshold between the world of the living and the terrifying unknown. For medieval villagers, nightfall ushered in creatures from beyond, spirits, demons, and forces they could neither understand nor control. It was in this unsettling environment that legends were born, shaping the fears that would linger in the collective consciousness for generations. As the world outside grew colder, darker, and more mysterious, the mind began to wander. Legends of monsters lurking in the shadows, ghosts haunting the old stone castles, and witches flying on broomsticks through thick fog filled the air. These tales weren't just bedtime stories or fairy tales meant to entertain children. They were born from real, lived experiences. In an age where literacy was scarce and communication was often fragmented, these stories were passed down through word of mouth, etched into the fabric of society, constantly evolving and growing darker with each retelling. Every crack in the stone walls, every gust of wind that rattled the window, every distant howl in the night became a whispered promise of something lurking just beyond the reach of human comprehension. The world of medieval Europe was defined by the unknown, and nothing was more terrifying than the possibility of the unknown being something that could reach into your life, touch you, and take you away. The supernatural wasn't just confined to folklore or the distant past. It was a present, pressing danger. In a time when disease could strike without warning, when war could break out in the blink of an eye, and when the next famine could wipe out entire communities, fear became a daily companion. But there was another dimension to this fear, the belief that something otherworldly was behind it all. People believed that misfortune wasn't merely the result of bad luck or nature's whims. It was the work of malevolent forces. Imagine the minds of medieval peasants and knights, priests and scholars, living under a constant veil of fear. They had no answers to horrors they witnessed. The plagues that ravaged villages, the mysterious deaths that seemed to strike with no apparent cause, the strange occurrences that defied logical explanation. As the night stretched on, the lines between reality and myth blurred. Some believed that the wandering spirits of the dead could return to haunt the living. Others feared that demons, summoned by witches or dark forces, walked the earth, waiting for the right moment to strike. The boundaries between the natural world and the supernatural world were thin, almost as if one could slip into the other without warning. But it wasn't just supernatural creatures that haunted the nights. The mind of medieval man also crafted terrifying images of forces that could rip through the world of the living, leaving destruction in their wake. These were not just imaginary monsters. They were the product of a deeply religious society that saw the hand of God or the devil in every moment of their existence. The church, the ultimate authority of the time, told its followers that the world was full of spirits, both good and evil, and that it was their duty to protect themselves from the dark forces. To fall into temptation or to give in to fear could mean eternal damnation. The church played a significant role in shaping the fears of the time, offering answers to the terrifying questions of life, death, and the afterlife. But often, these answers were steeped in dread. The souls of the dead were not always believed to rest in peace. There were legends of souls returning from the grave, unwilling to go into the afterlife until their wrongs were righted or their killers punished. Some believed that the dead would rise from their graves and walk the earth, seeking revenge on the living. The idea of spirits not resting peacefully became a central theme in the medieval imagination, feeding into the idea that the night was not just a time of rest, but a time when the restless dead were most powerful. But the night wasn't just about spirits and demons. It was also a time when witches and warlocks were thought to roam freely, practicing their dark arts under the cover of darkness. The witch hunts of medieval Europe are among the most chilling chapters in history, where the fear of the unknown took on a terrifying form. Witches were believed to have the power to summon evil forces, cast spells, and curse entire villages. The belief in witchcraft was so pervasive that entire communities lived in fear of being accused of consorting with the devil. A simple, unexplained illness could lead to accusations of witchcraft, and entire families could be torn apart. To live in such a world was to be constantly aware of the potential dangers lurking in every corner, and the night was when those dangers seemed most real. The medieval mindset also reflected a deeper fear of the outside world, of what lay beyond the safety of the forests, for example, were places of both mystery and danger. Legend spoke of terrible beasts that roamed the forest, creatures that could tear a person apart in an instant. These stories were meant to explain the unexplainable, to make sense of the strange sounds heard in the woods and the figures seen flitting through the trees. The fear of the unknown became so ingrained that it extended to everything, from the stars in the sky to the very soil beneath their feet. When the night fell, the sense of terror was all-encompassing. There was no escape from the horrors that seemed to lie just beyond the threshold of the home. The dark was not a void, but a place where the imagination could run wild, conjuring up creatures and forces too terrifying to name. For medieval people, sleep was often a perilous thing, for who could be sure that in their dreams they were not visited by something that would forever change their lives? Whether it was a fear of the devil, the restless dead, or creatures that lived in night, the shadows held a power over the medieval mind that is difficult for us to truly comprehend today. But these fears weren't just about superstition or imagination. They were very real to the people who lived in that time. The terrors of the night were as much a part of their daily lives as the threat of war, plague, and famine. It was a world where darkness meant something far more sinister, and every rustle in the bushes could be a warning of something that was about to strike. There was no comfort in the night, no peaceful sleep after the sun went down. Instead, it was a time when the very essence of fear was most palpable, a time when legends took on a life of their own, and the boundaries between the world of the living and the supernatural were thin, fragile, and easily crossed. The question isn't whether these stories were true or false. It's whether, in that time, the people of medieval Europe had any choice but to believe them. In a world so filled with danger, where the real and the imagined intertwined so seamlessly, could they afford not to believe? For the people of medieval Europe, the darkness was more than just the absence of light. It was a realm where the most terrifying of legends could come alive at any moment, and the night was a time when fear ruled supreme. The medieval mind was shaped by a reality so starkly different from our own that it's almost impossible to fully understand how people lived during those times. Life, for most people, was a delicate balancing act between survival and fear. Disease, famine, and violence were constant companions, and the unknown loomed large over every moment. The people of the Middle Ages did not experience the world as we do today. There were no scientific explanations for the many mysteries they encountered, no vaccines or antibiotics to save them from the plague, no modern transportation to offer quick escape from conflict. The medieval world was a place of uncertainty, where every corner seemed to hold some new, unseen danger. The fear that permeated medieval life wasn't born in the usual places we expect, such as from things that could be understood like hunger or illness. Instead, it thrived in the spaces where understanding had yet to take root. People in the Middle Ages were often consumed with the fear of the supernatural, a fear born from the belief that forces far beyond their comprehension were constantly at work. They didn't see the world as a place governed by natural laws, but as a place of divine intervention, where every action, no matter how small, had its purpose and consequence. In this worldview, everything, from the weather to harvest, could be affected by the divine will of God or the dark intentions of the devil. For medieval people, life was often lived under the shadow of these unseen forces. The church was a dominant influence on everyday life, and it played a pivotal role in shaping the fears of the time. According to church teachings, Everything in life was a sign of God's will, and it was up to the individual to interpret these signs and seek redemption. To live in fear of divine punishment or the devil's influence was not just common, it was a necessary part of spiritual life. The church emphasized the omnipresence of evil in the world and the constant threat of damnation that hung over every soul. A mere misstep in life, an error in judgment, could lead to eternal torment. This belief in spiritual warfare created a society where every person was on guard against the unseen forces that can invade their lives at any moment. The medieval mind was also deeply steeped in superstition. Even the most mundane events were often interpreted through the lens of fate and divine will. A sudden illness wasn't just an accident or a natural occurrence. It could be a punishment for some hidden sin, a result of someone's ill-wishing, or a sign that evil was at work in the world. Birthmarks and scars were seen as marks of the devil's influence, and strange phenomena were often attributed to the supernatural rather than to natural causes. The medieval world was full of omens, portents, and signs that guided people's actions and beliefs. For every cough, every storm, every unexplained event, there was a supernatural explanation, and it was up to the individual to decode it. This deep connection between superstition and religion created an atmosphere of fear. It wasn't just that people feared the devil or witches. They also feared the consequences of angering the supernatural forces that governed their lives. People believed that the devil could take on any form and enter the world at any time. He might disguise himself as a beggar, a wandering traveler, or even a priest. In a world where people lived in small communities, where family and faith were everything, this idea of evil lurking in the most familiar places created a sense of paranoia that became almost ingrained in daily life. But fear didn't only come from the supernatural. The very structure of medieval society was designed to keep people in a constant state of anxiety. There was no stability in life for most medieval peasants. Kings and lords ruled vast stretches of land, but their authority was often tenuous and constantly challenged by war, betrayal, and shifting allegiances. The feudal system, which was intended to provide protection and order, often resulted in instability and fear. People lived in constant fear of war. Kingdoms were in constant flux, and the boundaries between them were always in dispute. Battles were fought not only for land, but for control over resources, wealth, and power. It was a time when armies roamed the countryside, leaving destruction in their wake. Villages were frequently raided, and many people lost their homes and lives in these conflicts. Even in times of peace, there was no guarantee of safety. The ruling class had the power to exact harsh punishments on those beneath them, and there were always rumors of injustice, corruption, and cruelty. Feudal lords were not benevolent rulers. They were often oppressive and brutal, with power over life and death in their hands. Peasants lived in constant fear of being taxed into poverty, of being sold into servitude, or being caught up in the cruelty of a ruler's wrath. There was no protection against the abuses of the elite, and no recourse for those who were wronged. Fear, therefore, became an inescapable part of daily life, woven into the fabric of society itself. Religion offered an answer to the suffering and fear, but also amplified it. Church teachings told people that their suffering was a test of their faith, and that they must endure with patience and humility in order to be rewarded in the afterlife. But at the same time, the church reinforced the idea that evil was ever present. Sin was lurking around every corner, and damnation could come at any time. People were taught to live in fear of their own mortality and the possibility of falling into sin. This created a psychological landscape in which the line between the natural world and the supernatural was blurry, where it was impossible to tell whether one was suffering because of divine punishment or because of some external, demonic force at work. It wasn't just the peasants who lived in fear. Even those in positions of power, such as knights and nobles, were caught in the web of superstition and anxiety that defined the medieval world. They, too, feared the wrath of the gods, the rise of evil forces, and the ever-present threat of chaos. Knights, for example, were meant to be symbols of strength and honor, but they live in a world where their own survival often depended on supernatural forces. They carried talismans and charms to ward off evil, and many believe in the protective powers of relics and holy artifacts. Their lives were bound up with a constant awareness of the fragility of existence, of the tenuous grip they held on life in a world filled with violence, betrayal, and darkness. The idea of fate, or the belief that each person's life was governed by forces beyond their control, was another factor that shaped medieval fear. It was a time when people had little say in the course of their lives. Most were born into their station, destined to live out their days as peasants or laborers. The idea of upward mobility was almost unheard of, and the possibility of escaping one's fate was a rare exception. This sense of helplessness fostered an environment of fear. If your life was already written for you, there was little you could do to escape the horrors that might come your way. The world was vast and unpredictable, and fate often seemed like an unforgiving force. As medieval life unfolded, the boundaries between life and death, the natural and supernatural, became increasingly blurred. People lived in a state of constant fear, not just of the immediate dangers of disease, war, and poverty, but the unseen forces that govern the universe. For them, every day was a day to be endured, to be survived, and the night was just another part of that struggle. As the stars filled the sky and the darkness deepened, so too did the sense of dread. The stories people told, of witches, demons, ghosts, and gods, were a reflection of their inner turmoil, their need to understand and control a world that seemed to make no sense. These stories became their way of coping with the uncertainties of life, a means of explaining the unexplainable, and a way to make sense of a world that was in many ways out of their control. In a world where every shadow seemed to hold a threat, and every sound could signal the arrival of death or destruction, it's no wonder that medieval minds crafted such vivid and terrifying legends. These stories were more than just entertainment. They were warnings, lessons, and reflections of the fears that defined the medieval experience. The people of the Middle Ages didn't have the luxury of understanding the natural world as we do today, but they had something equally powerful, a rich tapestry of myth and belief that allowed them to confront the fears that haunted them, even if they could never fully escape them. The witch hunts that swept across Europe in the medieval period were born from a mixture of fear, superstition, and a deep-rooted influence of religion. The belief in witches and the fear they invoked were not just a product of isolated events or isolated cultures. They were part of broader, pervasive anxiety that gripped the collective mind of Europe. In a time when life was marked by uncertainty, disease, and the constant threat of war, the fear of witches became one of the most significant sources of terror for many people. To understand the extent of the witch hunts and the fear they generated, one must first look at the context in which they arose. A time of religious zeal, a constant struggle for power, and a population desperate for answers in the face of overwhelming hardship. The belief in witches was not something new to the medieval period, but during the 15th and 16th centuries, it reached a fever pitch. The medieval church, with its widespread influence, was central to the cultivation of this fear. Church teachings were steeped in the belief that the world was a battleground between God and the devil, and every individual was caught in the middle. The concept of witches as agents of the devil, people who had sold their souls to Satan in exchange for dark powers, took hold during this time. Witches were believed to be able to cast spells, summon demons, and even raise the dead. These acts were seen as the height of heresy, and those who practiced witchcraft were thought to be directly aligned with the forces of evil. The church saw itself as a protector of the Christian soul, and as a result, it was committed to rooting out any form of heresy that threatened the purity of the faith. Witches were portrayed as a direct threat to God's order and a dangerous society. The early church, however, was not as focused on witchcraft as it would later become. In fact, the first centuries of Christianity did not even include the concept of witchcraft as we understand it today. Christianity's battle was more often against pagans, other religious practices, and non-believers. It wasn't until the Middle Ages, particularly the 12th and 13th centuries, that the fear of witches began to take shape. The church's growing power in Europe coincided with a rise in superstition and a tendency to explain misfortune through supernatural causes. When things went wrong, whether through disease, famine, or inexplicable accidents, people began to look for someone or something to blame. The devil, long seen as a tempter and deceiver, became the perfect scapegoat for a variety of misfortunes. And witches, believed to be in league with the devil, were blamed for everything from crop failures to unexplained illnesses. The idea of witchcraft as a direct link between humans and the devil was solidified in 1486 by the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, written by two Dominican monks, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. This book became the most influential work in the witch hunts. It provided a detailed guide for identifying witches, conducting trials, and executing punishments. The book argued that witches were not just dangerous individuals who practiced magic, but that they were actively working to corrupt the soul and destroy society. It claimed that witches could transform into animals, fly through the air, and engage in sexual acts with demons. It was a comprehensive and terrifying portrayal of witches as agents of chaos, and it gave legal and moral justification for the witch hunts that would follow. The fear of witches was not just based on religious or theological concerns. It was also tied to social and political issues. In many parts of Europe, particularly in rural areas, life was difficult. People lived in constant fear of disease, famine, and war. The lack of scientific understanding meant that when something went wrong, people often had no explanation. The appearance of disease, especially the plague, was frequently attributed to witchcraft. When entire villages were struck by illness and people died in large numbers, there was a sense that some supernatural force was at work. This fear of disease, combined with a widespread belief in witchcraft, made accusations of witchcraft even more likely. People, especially those who were marginalized, such as widows, the poor, or the elderly, were often scapegoated as witches. They were blamed for everything from bad harvests to the deaths of livestock, and in many cases, the accusations were completely baseless. In this atmosphere of fear and distrust, the witch hunts became a powerful tool for controlling society. Local rulers, eager to demonstrate their authority and religious zeal, often supported witch hunts. The trials gave them a way to show their power, both over the people and over the forces of evil. It also allowed them to consolidate control over their territories by rooting out those who might pose a threat to their rule. Witch hunts became a political tool, as much as a religious one. Many trials were conducted by secular authorities, and the punishments for those found guilty were severe. Torture, execution by burning, hanging, and drowning were common forms of punishment for those accused of witchcraft. The trials were often brutal, with the accused subjected to unimaginable pain and suffering in an effort to extract confessions. One of the most infamous witch hunts took place in the small town of Pendle, England, in 1612. 12 people, mostly women, were accused of practicing witchcraft and were tried before a local magistrate. The trial was a spectacle, and the defendants were subjected to the most horrific treatment. One of the accused, an elderly woman named Demdike, was said to have used her supernatural powers to kill children and animals. She was believed to have been part of a coven that had existed for decades, and her trial was a culmination of years of rumors, accusations, and suspicions. The case was notorious not just because of the severity of the punishments, but because it highlighted how easily an entire community could be swept up in hysteria of witchcraft. In many cases, the accusations of witchcraft were based on little more than hearsay. Neighbors would report strange behavior, and those who were different in some way, whether through their appearance, their social standing, or their age, were often the first to be accused. The elderly, especially, were prime targets for witch hunts. In an age where medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, the appearance of age or frailty was often misinterpreted as a sign of supernatural power. Many older women, who lived alone and had no family to protect them, were accused of using witchcraft to manipulate others or to harm them. Some were even accused of making pacts with the devil to prolong their lives, or of using magic to control the minds of others. The witch hunts were not confined to any one country or region. They were a widespread phenomenon across Europe. From the 15th to the 18th centuries, thousands of people were accused of witchcraft, and tens of thousands were executed. The exact number of people who were killed during the witch hunts is difficult to determine, but estimates range from 40,000 to 60,000, with some estimates going as high as 100,000. These figures include not just those who were executed, but also those who died as a result of torture, imprisonment, or starvation. The witch hunts had a profound impact on European society. They fostered an atmosphere of fear and mistrust, where neighbors turned on each other, and entire communities were torn apart by accusations and suspicions. The witch hunts also had a lasting impact on the way people viewed the supernatural. The idea that witches were real and that they could be identified, tried, and executed became firmly ingrained in the collective psyche of Europe. For centuries after the witch hunts, people continued to believe in witches, even though the hunts themselves had largely died down by the end of the 18th century. The legacy of the witch hunts can still be seen today in a way that fear of the unknown shapes our beliefs and our fears. But what was it about the fear of witches that was so compelling? What made witchcraft accusations so potent, so capable of sweeping entire villages into hysteria? One reason, of course, was a deep fear of the devil and the belief that witches were in league with Satan. In a time when religious beliefs were all-encompassing, the idea that someone could defy God's will and consort with the devil was unthinkable. Witchcraft represented an affront to the very foundations of Christian society. But it wasn't just the religious implications that made witches so frightening. Witches were believed to have the power to disrupt the natural order. They were seen as agents of chaos, capable of inflicting harm and suffering on others. This fear of witches as forces of destruction, as beings who could wreak havoc on a community or a family, was at the heart of the witch hunts. They weren't just seen as practitioners of forbidden magic. They were seen as threats to the very fabric of society. The witch hunts were, in many ways, a reflection of the anxiety and fear that gripped medieval Europe, a fear of the unknown, of the forces that lay beyond human comprehension, and of the ever-present threat of evil. The idea of vampires has haunted human imagination for centuries, and in the medieval period, the fear of these creatures reached a terrifying peak. While today we might think of vampires in terms of popular fiction or horror films, the medieval conception of vampires was rooted in very real fears that revolved around death, disease, and the afterlife. The vampire was not just a creature of myth, but a symbol of the darkness that existed beyond the grave, and it was a manifestation of collective anxiety surrounding life's most inescapable truth, death. For medieval people, vampires were not mere figments of folklore. They were terrifying beings that could rise from the grave to suck the life out of the living. The origins of the vampire myth in medieval Europe can be traced to a time when death was not well understood. Life expectancy was low, and death was often sudden and unpredictable. Plagues, famine, and war claimed countless lives, and many of these deaths went unexplained. In the absence of scientific knowledge, people relied on superstition to make sense of the unexplainable. Bodies that were disinterred during times of plague often appeared unnaturally well-preserved, and their faces might even be bloated, or in some cases, blood might be found in the mouth. These signs were often misinterpreted, leading to the widespread belief that the dead were coming back to life in some horrific form, feeding off the living in order to prolong their own existence. The vampire, as a creature of death, became a symbol of this fear. It was believed that vampires were the souls of the dead who had returned to Earth in a twisted, cursed form. They were thought to be evil spirits who had been condemned to walk the earth for eternity. These creatures were seen as a direct threat to the living, capable of draining the life force from those unfortunate enough to encounter them. In some regions, the vampire was said to be a revenant, a corpse that had risen from the grave to feed on the blood of the living. In others, the vampire was believed to be a demon or a supernatural creature, sent by the devil to prey on the innocent. In medieval Europe, the fear of vampires was often linked to the spread of disease. During times of plague, entire villages could be wiped out in a matter of weeks, and the sudden and unexplained deaths of so many people created a fertile ground for superstitions. When a new illness struck, and people began to die in large numbers, it was not uncommon for villagers to look for someone or something to blame. The vampire myth became one way to explain the suffering that seemed to have no rational cause. When a family was struck by disease and several members died in quick succession, the surviving villagers might accuse one of the deceased of being a vampire, believing that the dead were causing the living to fall ill. One of the most well-known vampire legends in medieval Europe comes from the region of Eastern Europe, specifically the Carpathian Mountains. It was here, in the heart of the Slavic world, that the vampire myth truly took root. The legend of the vampire in this region is tied to the figure of the strigoi, a type of undead creature that was said to feed on the blood of the living. The strigoi were believed to be the souls of the dead who had returned to Earth, driven by a hunger for blood. The myth of the strigoi was a central part of Romanian folklore and played a significant role in shaping the vampire legend that would later become famous worldwide. The vampire myth in Eastern Europe was not limited to just one form of the creature. There were many variations, but the most common belief was that a vampire was someone who had lived a wicked life or had been cursed after death. Some believed that a vampire could be created if a person died in an unnatural way, such as through murder, suicide, or an accidental death. Others believed that a person who had been excommunicated from the church or had lived a life of sin could become a vampire after death. In some cases, it was thought that the vampire's body would undergo physical changes, such as growing longer nails, hair, or teeth. These physical signs were believed to be proof that the person had become a vampire, and villagers would often take extreme measures to prevent the creature from rising from a grave. One of the most famous stories of medieval vampire lore is that of Vlad the Impaler, the 15th century ruler of Wallachia, who became the inspiration for the modern-day figure of Count Dracula. Vlad III, known as Vlad Tepes or Vlad Dracula, was a brutal and bloodthirsty ruler who was notorious for his cruelty and his penchant for impaling his enemies on long wooden stakes. While there is no evidence that Vlad actually drank blood, his violent reign and the tales of his cruelty contributed to the vampire myths that were developing in the region. His association with vampires was further popularized by Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula, which combined the legend of Vlad the Impaler with a growing fascination with the supernatural. However, the vampire myth was not confined to Eastern Europe. Throughout medieval Europe, there were countless reports of vampire-like creatures, some of which took on different forms. In parts of Germany and France, there were stories of the revanchists who were believed to return from the grave to avenge their deaths. In other areas, the lamia, a vampiric creature often depicted as a woman, was believed to suck the blood of children and drink from the veins of the living. In England, the vampire was often portrayed as a terrifying ghost who came back to seek revenge on those who had wronged them in life. The vampire's power was believed to be not only physical but also spiritual. It was thought that the vampire could possess the souls of the living, turning them into undead creatures as well. This idea of the vampire as a soul stealer contributed to the fear surrounding these creatures. The idea of a vampire transforming someone into a monster was particularly terrifying, as it represented a complete loss of agency. The victim could become a mindless servant of the vampire, forced to feed on others to survive. This fear of spiritual possession was deeply rooted in medieval Christian beliefs, which held that the soul was the most sacred part of a person and could be corrupted or damned by evil forces. To prevent a vampire from rising from the grave, medieval people took many precautions. Bodies were often buried with heavy stones placed on top of the coffin, and in some cases, spikes were driven to the corpse's heart to ensure that the vampire would not be able to rise. In certain regions, it was believed that a vampire could be thwarted by burying it face down, so that when it rose, it would be forced to dig into the earth instead of emerging from its grave. In other cases, villagers would perform rituals to protect themselves from the vampire, including sprinkling holy water on the grave or placing garlic around the perimeter of the burial site. These measures were seen as vital to keeping the vampire at bay, as the fear of the undead was so great that it was believed the slightest lapse in precaution could result in the vampire's return. The fear of vampires was also tied to the broader social and cultural climate of medieval Europe. The vampire, as a creature of darkness, represented everything that was feared and unknown. It was a symbol of death that refused to stay in the grave, and it was often linked to the idea of eternal damnation. The vampire's ability to rise from the grave and continue feeding on the living made it a powerful metaphor for the fear of death itself. Specifically, the fear of death that did not bring peace but instead led to eternal suffering. In a world where death was often violent and unpredictable, the idea of a vampire lurking just beyond the grave served as a constant reminder that death could come at any time, and it could come in a form far worse than what was imagined. The vampire myth, like so many other medieval legends, was born from a need to explain the unexplainable. People needed a way to make sense of the suffering, disease, and death that surrounded them, and the vampire provided a convenient and terrifying answer. It was not just a creature of fantasy. It was a symbol of the darkness that lay just beyond the threshold of the known world. The vampire myth, while shaped by medieval fears, would go on to evolve in later centuries, eventually becoming the iconic figure we recognize today. But the vampire of the medieval world was not just a monster. It was a symbol of the deepest fears and uncertainties of the time, a fear of death, of disease, and of the unknown forces that seemed to govern the lives of every person. In the darkness of medieval Europe, where superstitions ruled and the unknown was often far more terrifying than known, one figure stood as a source of both fear and fascination: the werewolf. The legend of the werewolf, like many of the other creatures that haunted medieval minds, was born from a combination of superstition, societal fears, and the eerie relationship that humans had with the wilderness. The werewolf was not just a creature of folklore, but a living embodiment of mankind's darkest impulses, and the belief in these terrifying half-human, half-animal beings took root deeply in medieval Europe. It was a time when the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were so thin that the very idea of transformation, of becoming something else, something wild, was all too believable. To understand why the werewolf held such a powerful grip on medieval imaginations, it's necessary to look at the context of the time. Life in the Middle Ages was harsh and unforgiving. People lived in small, tightly knit communities, where survival depended on agriculture, trade, and close relationships with family and neighbors. The world beyond the village, particularly the vast, dark forests that surrounded many communities, was a place of mystery, danger, and fear. The forest was not just a physical space, but a symbolic one. It represented the unknown, the wild, and the untamed forces of nature that could not be controlled or understood. This fear of the wilderness extended to the creatures that lived in it. Wolves, in particular, were seen as both predators and symbols of the untamed, chaotic forces that threatened human society. Their howls echoed through the forest at night, reminding villagers that they lived on the edge of a wild and dangerous world. The wolf, as a symbol of untamed ferocity and primal power, became a natural foundation for the myth of the werewolf. The word werewolf itself comes from the Old English werewolf, meaning man-wolf, which reflects the central theme of the myth, a person who transforms into a wolf. In medieval Europe, wolves were feared for their ability to attack livestock, spread disease, and hunt in packs. They were the embodiment of nature's cruelty, and for many people, the idea of a human being able to take on the wolf's form was both terrifying and fascinating. The werewolf, in this sense, was not merely a creature of night. It was a reminder that humanity itself was not immune to the primal forces that lurked in the dark corners of the world. The concept of humans transforming into wolves or other animals was not new in the Middle Ages. It can be traced back to ancient myths and stories from cultures all over the world, from the ancient Greeks, who had tales of gods and heroes changing shape, to the Norse myths of the berserkers, warriors who were said to transform into wolves or bears in the heat of battle. The idea of shape-shifting has long been a part of human storytelling. In medieval Europe, this myth was embraced and adapted, particularly as fear of witches, magic, and the supernatural grew. The idea that a person could change into a wolf, lose their humanity, and give in to their most primal urges struck a deep chord in society that was already steeped in fear of the unknown and the uncontrollable forces of nature. In the Middle Ages, the werewolf was often portrayed as a human who had made a pact with the devil or who had been cursed for some transgression. This connection to evil, sin, and darkness was a key component of the werewolf myth. The transformation into a wolf was seen as a loss of humanity, a descent into bestiality and savagery. The werewolf was not simply a creature of myth. It was a symbol of everything that medieval society feared, of the breakdown of moral order, of the loss of reason, and of the wild, uncontrollable forces that threatened the safety and stability of human life. The werewolf was also a powerful metaphor for the idea of duality, the human versus the animal, the civilized versus the savage. To be a werewolf was to be caught between two worlds, neither fully human nor fully animal, and this sense of liminality added to the horror of the legend. A person who became a werewolf was seen as a creature of chaos, a being who had given up their place in the world of men in favor of the wild, untamed forces of nature. The medieval fear of werewolves was not confined to just stories and folklore. It was a deeply ingrained belief that manifested in the real world. There were several notorious werewolf trials during the medieval period, where people were accused of transforming into wolves and committing terrible acts. The most infamous of these trials took place in the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly in France and Germany, where belief in the werewolf was at its height. In 1521, for example, in the small village of Poligny in France, a man named Gilles Garnier was arrested and tried for allegedly killing and eating several children while in the form of a wolf. He confessed to being a werewolf, claiming that he had made a pact with the devil. Garnier was ultimately executed for his crimes, but his case was far from isolated. Over the next few centuries, there were hundreds of werewolf trials in Europe, many of them resulting in executions. People who were accused of being werewolves were often subjected to horrific trials, including torture, and confessions were frequently extracted under duress. The werewolf trials were often part of a larger wave of fear and persecution that gripped Europe during this time. The growing influence of the Church, with its emphasis on the struggle between good and evil, helped to fuel the belief in werewolves as agents of the devil. In a society that was already fearful of witches, demons, and other supernatural forces, the idea of werewolves was a logical extension of this belief system. Just as witches were seen as women who had sold their souls to the devil, werewolves were believed to be men and women who had made the same dark pact in exchange for the power to transform into a wolf. Both groups were considered a threat to the moral and religious order, and both were hunted down and persecuted in a climate of fear and suspicion. The werewolf, in this context, was more than just a creature of terror. It was a symbol of everything that could go wrong in a world where human life was precarious and filled with danger. For the people of medieval Europe, the werewolf represented the collapse of civilization itself. It was a reminder that beneath the veneer of human society, there were dark forces lurking, waiting to break free. It also reflected a deep-seated fear of the wild, of what lay beyond the safety of the village, and of the forces that could not be tamed or understood. The wolf was a creature of the wilderness, and the werewolf was a creature that bridged the gap between humanity and the wild, uncontrollable forces of nature. There were many different interpretations of the werewolf myth, and the creature was often depicted in different ways depending on the region and the particular beliefs of the time. In some areas, the werewolf was seen as a tragic figure, a person who had been cursed or was a victim of dark forces. In others, the werewolf was seen as a ruthless killer, a creature who killed for pleasure or out of some primal hunger. The werewolf was often depicted as a man who had no control over his actions when transformed, a victim of his own animal instincts. This idea of the werewolf as a victim of fate, trapped between two worlds, gave the myth a tragic element. It was not simply about fear of the creature itself, but about the fear of losing control, of becoming something monstrous and uncontrollable. The fear of the werewolf also touched on deeper, more existential fears. The medieval period was a time when life was fragile and death was an ever-present reality. People lived in constant fear of disease, famine, and war, and the werewolf became a metaphor for the uncontrollable forces that could snatch away life in an instant. In a world where so much was beyond human control, the werewolf represented the ultimate loss of agency. The terrifying idea that a person could lose their humanity and become something else entirely. The werewolf myth was not just about a creature that could transform into a wolf. It was about the fear of transformation itself, the fear of being consumed by forces beyond one's control, and the terror of being turned into something monstrous. The legacy of the werewolf myth lives on in modern popular culture, but its origins in medieval Europe were steeped in real fears of the unknown, the wild, and the untamable forces of nature. The werewolf, as a symbol of chaos and primal power, was a reflection of the deep anxieties that defined life in the Middle Ages. For the people of medieval Europe, the werewolf was not just a monster to be feared. It was a manifestation of the darkness that lay just beyond the reach of human understanding, a reminder that the world was full of dangers that could not be contained. In the midst of the turbulence that marked the medieval period, where fear and superstition shaped the everyday lives of people, the concept of ghosts and spirits was not merely a passing notion, but a deeply rooted belief. Death, with all its mystery and finality, was a profound and unsettling presence. In a world where life expectancy was short and the specter of disease, famine, and violence loomed over every person, death was never far away. It was not simply a matter of the end of existence. It was feared as a transition to something far more ominous. The very idea of what happened after death, whether the soul found peace or remained in limbo, was a subject of immense anxiety. People were terrified not just by the finality of death itself, but by the possibility that the dead might not rest in peace. The belief in ghosts and spirits was, therefore, more than a fascination with the afterlife. It was an essential part of medieval thought, a way to make sense of the mysteries of life, and a means of confronting the fear of death. The medieval understanding of the afterlife was rooted in Christian doctrine, which emphasized the notion of eternal life in heaven or hell. However, there was no clear or consistent understanding of what happened to the soul immediately after death. Was the soul judged immediately, or did it linger on earth, unable to move on? The Church's teachings were far from definitive on the subject, and as a result, a number of superstitions and folk beliefs grew in a vacuum left by uncertainty. In many communities, there was a widespread belief that the souls of the dead could return to haunt the living if they had not been properly laid to rest. The idea that a soul could become restless or trapped was not only part of Christian belief, but also drew on older, pagan traditions that viewed the dead as potentially dangerous forces if not properly honored. The belief in ghosts was pervasive throughout medieval Europe, and there were countless stories of apparitions and spectral visitations. These ghosts were often believed to be the souls of the deceased who had not found peace. Perhaps they had been wronged in life or had died in a violent or untimely manner. In these cases, their spirits were thought to be restless, unable to move on, and thus they returned to the mortal world to seek vengeance or to finish some unfinished business. In other cases, the dead were believed to return to offer warnings, to prevent further harm, or to relay important messages from beyond the grave. The idea of the ghost as a messenger from the afterlife was a common theme, particularly in times of crisis. In medieval Europe, where war, plague, and famine were ever-present threats, the dead were often seen as playing an active role in guiding the living through these hardships. But not all ghosts were seen as benevolent. In fact, many were thought to be dangerous, malevolent entities, intent on causing harm to the living. The notion of a ghost seeking revenge was a common one. Ghosts that had been wronged in life were believed to return to exact vengeance on those who had caused their suffering. This belief in vengeful spirits was particularly prevalent during times of social upheaval. When violence or injustice had been done, it was thought that the ghosts would return, bringing about further suffering. Ghost stories, therefore, were not just about haunting. They were often about the consequences of moral or ethical failure. In a time when justice was not always available or effective, the belief in ghosts as agents of divine justice served as a reminder that those who wronged others would eventually face the consequences of their actions. These apparitions were not confined to any one particular location. They could appear anywhere, from the home to the battlefield, from the church to the forest. Ghosts were often associated with places where death had occurred violently or unnaturally. Battlefields, where countless lives had been lost, were considered especially haunted, and many stories tell the restless spirits of fallen soldiers who would return to the site of their death, seeking solace or revenge. The idea of a battlefield being haunted by the dead was not only tied to the violence and trauma of war, but also reflected the deep belief that war itself was a moral and spiritual affront. The dead who had been taken prematurely or unjustly, through violence or betrayal, were thought to return, forever tied to the very place where they had met their end. Beyond the battlefield, the home was another space where ghosts were believed to linger. It was thought that the souls of the dead might return to visit their families, to comfort them, or make sure that their worldly affairs were properly handled. In some cases, the ghosts might appear to offer advice or warnings, urging the living to correct mistakes or avoid danger. These apparitions were often seen as a form of guidance, a way for the dead to still influence the lives of the living. However, not all visits were peaceful. The fear of the restless dead was pervasive in many medieval cultures, and there were numerous stories of malicious spirits who would torment their living relatives, often causing harm or misfortune as a form of punishment for some perceived wrong. The Church, as the dominant religious institution in medieval Europe, was deeply involved in belief in ghosts and spirits. The clergy were often called upon to perform rituals to help the souls of the dead find peace. The most common of these rituals was a requiem mass, a service of the dead that was intended to ensure that the soul of the deceased would be able to rest in peace. The Church believed that the soul could linger in a state of purgatory, suffering for its sins until it was purified and allowed to enter heaven. However, it was also believed that the dead could become trapped between this world and the next, their souls unable to find peace unless properly guided. The Church, therefore, played a crucial role in managing the fears surrounding death and the afterlife. Despite the Church's efforts to provide comfort and assurance about the afterlife, many people still clung to superstitions and folk beliefs about ghosts. The idea that the dead could return to haunt the living was not simply a matter of belief. It was a deeply ingrained fear that permeated everyday life. It was believed that certain conditions could cause a soul to return as a ghost. Violent deaths, such as those caused by murder or execution, were thought to be especially likely to result in the soul returning. This fear was especially strong during times of war, when the dead were often left unburied or improperly mourned. Unburied bodies, in particular, were thought to be prone to becoming restless spirits. For this reason, proper burial rites were considered essential, not only for the peace of the soul, but for the safety of the living. If a body was not properly cared for, or if the deceased was not given proper funeral, it was believed that the spirit would be unable to move on, becoming a malevolent presence that haunted the living. The fear of ghosts was not only about what the dead might do, it was also about the way death was viewed in medieval Europe. In a society where death was sudden and often violent, the idea of an unresolved death, one where the person's fate was uncertain, was a terrifying thought. People feared that if they did not properly mourn the dead or perform the correct rites, they might be subject to the anger of the deceased. The idea of the restless ghost, seeking resolution, was deeply tied to medieval views on the importance of ritual and respect for the dead. These rituals were not just about showing respect to the deceased, but were seen as a way of ensuring that the dead did not return to cause harm. The dead, in this sense, were both a source of comfort and a source of terror. They were a reflection of the instability of life, the fragility of the human body, and the fear of the unknown that linger in the hearts of all medieval people. The belief in ghosts was also closely tied to the fear of the supernatural. In a world where illness, death, and disaster were often seen as signs of divine wrath or demonic influence, the idea of a ghost returning to the mortal world added another layer of fear to the already fraught landscape of medieval existence. Ghosts were not only a symbol of death, but a symbol of the forces beyond human understanding, forces that could never be fully controlled or explained. They represented the unknown, the realm of the afterlife that was shrouded in mystery and fear. For the medieval person, the boundary between life and death was not just physical, but metaphysical. The dead were not gone, but were merely hidden, waiting to return to the world of the living in ways that were both feared and revered. The legacy of these medieval ghost stories and beliefs can still be seen today. Ghosts, as symbols of the restless dead, continue to be a part of modern folklore and popular culture. Yet the medieval fear of ghosts was not just about the supernatural. It was about the deeper anxieties of life, death, and what happens in between. In an age where the mysteries of the afterlife were not easily understood, ghosts were the embodiment of the unknown, forever tethered to the world of the living, never fully at peace. The fear of the dead was as much a fear of the living, and the very idea of what happens after death was one of the most terrifying questions humanity has ever faced. The medieval period was a time of deep superstition, religious fervor, and societal anxiety. In this environment, the fear of demonic possession and the associated exorcisms that sought to rid individuals of malevolent forces became a major aspect of both religious and everyday life. The idea that a person could be overtaken by a demon, transforming into someone unrecognizable, driven by dark forces and lost themselves, struck terror into the hearts of both the common people and the clergy. The notion of demonic possession was not just an abstract concept, but a terrifying reality that could happen to anyone at any time. It was seen as a direct attack by Satan, and it was believed that only through divine intervention, often in the form of an exorcism, could the soul of the possessed individual be saved and returned to its rightful state. Demonic possession was closely tied to the theological underpinnings of the time. In medieval Christian belief, the world was seen as a constant battleground between good and evil, with every individual caught in this cosmic struggle. God and Satan were locked in eternal war, and the human soul was a prize. Possession by demons was viewed as the ultimate manifestation of this battle, a person's body and soul overtaken by forces of darkness. It was believed that demons could enter a person's body in various ways: through sin, through witchcraft, through the breaking of religious laws, or even through the mere presence of evil in the world. These forces were believed to be so powerful and malevolent that they could not be resisted by ordinary human means. The fear of demonic possession was not limited to religious contexts, but was deeply intertwined with everyday life. Medieval Europe was a time of great hardship, disease, and violence. People faced constant threats to their physical safety, their health, and their lives. Famine, plague, and war were regular occurrences, and there was little understanding of how to cope with such forces. In the absence of medical explanations for disease, it was common for people to attribute strange behaviors, illnesses, or mental disturbances to supernatural causes. A person who fell ill, particularly if they exhibited erratic behavior or became violent, was often suspected of being possessed by a demon. This idea of possession was not just limited to physical illness, but extended to mental illness as well. Mental health conditions, which were not well understood, were often interpreted through the lens of demonic influence. People who experience hallucinations, seizures, or extreme changes in behavior might be seen as victims of demonic possession, rather than suffering from a medical condition. The fear of possession was compounded by the growing power of the church. As the church expanded its influence throughout Europe, it became the authority on matters of both spiritual and physical health. The church not only defined what was considered acceptable behavior, but also had the power to determine when someone was under the influence of dark forces. The clergy, particularly those who specialized in exorcisms, became the gatekeepers of the divine and purveyors of salvation. They were trained to recognize the signs of demonic possession and to perform the necessary rituals to expel the evil spirit. The process of exorcism was seen as a sacred and powerful act, one that required not just physical rituals, but also the spiritual authority of the priest conducting it. Exorcisms were often seen as a last resort, performed when all other remedies have failed, and they were intended to return a possessed individual to a state of grace. Exorcisms were dramatic, ritualistic events, and they were often conducted in front of an audience. The belief was that the demon would fight fiercely to maintain control over his victim, and the exorcist would have to call on the power of God to overcome this resistance. The rituals involved in exorcisms varied, but typically included prayers, the reading of sacred texts, the use of holy water, and the invocation of the name of God and saints. The exorcist would often demand that the demon identify itself and leave the possessed person's body, usually through the person's mouth. During an exorcism, the person being possessed might display signs of extreme physical distress, twitching, convulsions, vomiting, or speaking in strange languages. These symptoms were believed to be the demon's final efforts to fight off the power of the exorcist and to maintain its hold on the individual. The church's involvement in exorcisms was not without controversy. However, while some priests and clergy members viewed the act of exorcism as a divine calling and a necessary means of protecting the soul, others were more skeptical of its effectiveness. There were also instances where people accused of being possessed were subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment during exorcism rituals. In some cases, the process was more about physical punishment than spiritual healing. For instance, individuals undergoing exorcism might be tied down, beaten, or subjected to harsh physical conditions in an attempt to force the demon out. This treatment, combined with the extreme physical symptoms of possession, often led to tragic outcomes. Some individuals undergoing exorcisms died as a result of the physical strain or from the lack of proper medical care. One of the most well-known cases of demonic possession in medieval history occurred in the 16th century in the town of Loudun, France. A group of nuns at a convent in Loudun began exhibiting strange behaviors, convulsions, speaking in tongues, and violent outbursts. The local priest, Urbain Grandier, was accused of causing possession through witchcraft, and he was eventually tried and executed. The case became infamous, not just for the exorcism itself, but for the public spectacle that surrounded it. The events in Loudun exemplified the intersection of fear, superstition, and religious authority in medieval Europe, and they played a significant role in the development of the public perception of demonic possession and exorcisms. Exorcism also had a broader cultural significance. The fear of demonic possession was tied to the broader societal anxiety about the power of the devil and his ability to infiltrate the lives of ordinary people. The belief that a person could be overtaken by evil forces was a terrifying thought because it suggested that no one was safe from the devil's influence. It reflected a fear that even the most devout and holy individuals could fall prey to sin and become instruments of Satan. The idea of possession was also connected to fears about the loss of agency and self-control. In a world where life was already marked by uncertainty, poverty, and disease, the thought of being completely overtaken by an external force, of losing one's body and soul to a demon, was one of the ultimate fears. It represented the loss of the self, the destruction of one's very identity. Demonic possession was also seen as a sign of moral or spiritual decay. The possessed individual was often viewed as someone who had fallen into sin, someone who had opened themselves up to the forces of darkness through their actions or thoughts. The concept of possession served as a warning to the broader community. It was a reminder that sin could lead to a loss of control, that the devil was always lurking, ready to seize those who strayed from the path of righteousness. The exorcism was not just about removing a demon. It was about restoring the person to a state of grace, to a position where they could once again be part of the community of the faithful. As time went on, the fear of possession and the practice of exorcism began to diminish, especially as science and medicine advanced. The rise of psychiatry and the growing understanding of mental illness led to a shift in the way possession was understood. Many of the symptoms once attributed to demonic influence, such as seizures, hallucinations, and violent behavior, were now seen through a medical lens. However, the belief in possession has not disappeared entirely. In some parts of the world today, exorcism remains an important religious practice, and the fear of demonic influence continues to be a part of cultural and spiritual beliefs. The history of demonic possession in medieval Europe is not just a story about fear and superstition. It is a reflection of the deep anxieties that people face in a world filled with uncertainty, disease, and violence. The idea of possession represented the ultimate loss of control, the fear that an individual's body and soul could be taken by an external, malevolent force. Exorcisms were both an act of faith and a way of confronting this terrifying fear. They were a means of restoring order in a world that often seemed to be out of control, a way of reaffirming the power of God over the forces of evil. Even in a world where medical science has advanced far beyond beliefs of medieval Europe, the fear of possession and the power of exorcism continue to resonate with people, reminding us of the ancient fears that still linger in the human psyche. The medieval period, characterized by its blend of superstition, religion, and uncertainty, saw the emergence of one of the most disturbing fears, the fear of witches and witchcraft. To the people of the Middle Ages, witchcraft was not merely a superstition or an isolated belief, but a terrifying reality that had the power to destroy lives and communities. Witches were thought to be individuals who had made pacts with the devil, turning their backs on God and aligning themselves with the forces of darkness. The idea that such individuals lived among the community, often in plain sight, was deeply unsettling. The witch, in the medieval mind, was a person who had the ability to cause harm through supernatural means, be it through curses, hexes, or the manipulation of natural forces. This fear, rooted in a combination of religious beliefs, social tensions, and a deep-seated fear of the unknown, led to one of the darkest chapters in European history, the witch hunts. In medieval Europe, witches were often depicted as both a social and spiritual threat. The idea of witchcraft was tied to the notion that there were malevolent forces in the world that could be called upon by individuals who had turned their backs on God. These witches were believed to possess supernatural abilities that allowed them to control the elements, cast spells, and even raise the dead. But what made witchcraft particularly terrifying was the belief that it was an invisible force. Witches did not always appear outwardly different from anyone else. They lived among the people, often blending into everyday life. Their power was believed lay in their ability to manipulate the natural world, unseen by the untrained eye. This fear of the invisible, of an evil force operating just beneath the surface, made witchcraft especially unsettling. The fear of witches was particularly potent because it was believed that their powers were most dangerous when hidden. The very act of witchcraft, according to medieval belief, was often done in secret. Witches were thought to hold dark, occult knowledge that allowed them to harm others without being caught. This secrecy made it nearly impossible for communities to protect themselves. Villagers could not always trust their neighbors, as it was said that witches often operated under the guise of ordinary life. In this context, accusations of witchcraft were not just about spiritual corruption, but also about social distrust. The fear of witches was a reflection of the larger fears about what lay beneath the surface of human behavior. In an era where diseases and disasters struck without warning, where people lived in constant fear of famine, war, and death, witches were blamed for many misfortunes that seemed inexplicable. Crop failures, the sudden death of livestock, unexplained illness, and other calamities were often attributed to witchcraft. If something went wrong in a community, it was all too easy to blame a neighbor for invoking the supernatural to cause harm. The witch hunts, which began in earnest during the medieval period and continued into the early modern period, were fueled by a combination of religious fervor, social unrest, and political power. The Catholic Church played a significant role in spreading the fear of witches. The Church's teachings were clear. Witches were servants of the devil, and they were to be eradicated. The The church taught that witchcraft was a grave sin, a direct challenge to divine order, and it urged its followers to seek out and punish witches. The belief in witchcraft was not confined to any single Christian sect, but was widespread throughout Europe. Both the Catholic and Protestant churches viewed witchcraft as a serious threat to the stability of society, and both sanctioned the use of torture and execution as means of rooting out witches. In the 1480s, the publication of Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, by two Dominican friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, solidified the church's stance on witchcraft. The Malleus was a treatise that described in detail how to identify, prosecute, and punish witches. It was filled with instructions on how to extract confessions from those accused of witchcraft, often through violent means. The Malleus Maleficarum was not just a book. It was a manual for persecution, and became one of the most influential works in shaping the witch hunts across Europe. The book emphasized the idea that witches were both physically and spiritually corrupt. They were believed to have made pacts with Satan, to be capable of cursing and bewitching others, and to have the power to summon demons. It also suggested that witches often carried out their dark work in secret, away from the eyes of the public, making it even more difficult to detect them. The witch hunts were not limited to just a few isolated incidents. They became widespread and pervasive across Europe. People of all classes were accused of witchcraft, though, in practice, women were far more likely to be accused than men. This was due in part to the medieval view of women as being more susceptible to temptation and sin. The church often portrayed women as inherently weaker than men, more likely to fall prey to the devil's wiles. The witch hunts reflected this misogynistic view, with women being particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. Witches were often depicted as old women, living alone on the outskirts of villages, people who were seen as strange or different from the rest of society. These women, particularly those who were marginalized or had no family to defend them, were often easy targets for suspicion. Once accused of witchcraft, individuals could be subjected to brutal trials and torture. Trials were often based on flimsy or non-existent evidence. For example, a person might be accused of being a witch because they were known to have had a quarrel with someone who later fell ill or suffered misfortune. Physical characteristics, such as moles or birthmarks, were also often seen as signs of witchcraft. In some cases, a suspected witch might be forced to undergo the swimming test, in which the accused would be tied up and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were considered guilty, as it was believed that the water would reject them as a sign of their pact with the devil. If they sank and drowned, they were often seen as innocent. These tests were designed to either prove guilt or death, regardless of whether the individual was actually a witch. The torture of suspected witches was also rampant. Accusations of witchcraft were often followed by intense physical abuse designed to extract confessions. The rack, the Iron Maiden, and other instruments of torture were used to force victims to admit to their supposed crimes. In many cases, the confessions obtained under duress were used as proof of guilt. These confessions often included the names of other supposed witches, and so the witch hunts grew in scale, with entire communities being torn apart by suspicion and fear. The witch hunts reached their peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, with countries like Germany, France, and England seeing large-scale purges of supposed witches. The Malleus Maleficarum was only one part of a broader movement across Europe that sought to root out witchcraft wherever it was thought to exist. The fear of witches also became increasingly intertwined with political and social struggles. Witch hunts were sometimes used as tools to consolidate power, to target minorities, or to eliminate rivals. In some cases, the accusations of witchcraft were driven by jealousy, greed, or personal vendettas. People might accuse their neighbors of witchcraft in order to seize their land or property. The witch hunts were thus not merely religious or spiritual in nature. They were deeply tied to the social, economic, and political dynamics of the time. The witch hunts eventually began to subside, largely due to the rise of reason, science, and the spread of Enlightenment thought. The belief in witchcraft, although still present in some parts of Europe, began to wane as more rational explanations for natural phenomena became available. The once dominant church, with its firm grip on the spiritual and political life of Europe, lost its authority as scientific inquiry began to challenge traditional religious views. As a result, the witch hunts slowly faded. Though the damage had been done, Thousands of people, most of them women, have been accused, tortured, and executed, and the legacy of the witch hunts still haunts European history to this day. The medieval fear of witches is a chilling reminder of the dangers of superstition, fear, and blind faith. It speaks to the ways in which societies can be manipulated by fear and the consequences of targeting vulnerable individuals based on irrational beliefs. In the medieval era, the witch represented the unknown, the unexplainable, and the frighteningly unpredictable forces of nature. To the people of that time, the witch was a symbol of everything that was feared, of dark powers that could not be controlled, of evil that could take root even in the most familiar and trusted places. And in the shadows of this fear, the witch hunts, with their horrific toll on human lives, stand as one of the darkest chapters in human history. In the medieval world, the perception of the supernatural was closely intertwined with the realities of everyday life. One of the most prevalent and terrifying fears that emerged during this period was the fear of vampires. Though the vampire myth has evolved over the centuries, its roots lie deep in medieval Europe, where it was not just a myth or superstition, but a pervasive terror that affected both the lives of common people and the practices of the church. The vampire, as a creature of night, was seen as a predatory being, a monstrous, bloodthirsty entity that preyed on the living and posed an existential threat to both the body and the soul. The vampire legend, steeped in fear, mystery, and death, took on many different forms across Europe, but the underlying belief remained consistent. The vampire was a creature of darkness, a being that defied the natural order, and one that had the power to bring destruction wherever it appeared. The fear of vampires can be traced back to the belief in the return of the dead, something that was deeply embedded in medieval culture. Death, particularly in times of plague, disease, and war, was often sudden and unpredictable. The dead were not always seen as simply passing into the afterlife. Many believed that they could return to haunt the living. This fear of the restless dead was magnified by the lack of understanding about disease and death itself. The medieval population had little knowledge of the medical causes of death or the processes involved in decomposition, and thus many natural phenomena were explained through supernatural means. The sight of a body that had not fully decomposed or the discovery of graves that appeared to have been disturbed would easily fuel the belief that the dead could rise again. The vampire, in its most basic form, was believed to be the corpse of someone who had died but had returned to life in a new, terrifying form. This returned being, known as an undead creature, was not simply a dead person who had risen, but someone who existed in a twisted, unnatural state, neither truly alive nor truly dead. The vampire was often depicted as having unnatural features, such as pale skin, sharp fangs, and glowing eyes. It was said to have the ability to drain the life force from others, particularly through the act of blood drinking. The act of consuming blood, in the medieval understanding, was seen as a powerful and life-giving force. By draining the blood of the living, the vampire was thought to restore its own vitality and, in many cases, to extend its life indefinitely. The vampire's predatory nature, along with its ability to turn the natural order upside down, made it one of the most feared supernatural creatures of the medieval period. While many other legends revolve around external forces, such as demons, ghosts, and witches, the vampire represented an existential threat that blurred the lines between life and death. The vampire, as a creature that existed outside the normal cycles of life, was seen as a grotesque perversion of nature. In many cases, it was believed that a vampire's soul had been damned forever, making an agent of evil. The vampire was not just a physical threat, but a spiritual one as well. It was an embodiment of decay, corruption, and death itself. In medieval Europe, the vampire myth was especially prominent in regions like Eastern Europe, where it was deeply intertwined with the belief in the strigoi, a type of undead creature. In these areas, the vampire legend was not just folklore, but deeply ingrained cultural fear. Villages would go to great lengths to prevent the dead from rising. One of the most common practices involved staking the dead, often through the heart, to ensure that they would not return to life. Other methods of prevention included decapitation, dismemberment, or burying the body face down to ensure that it could not rise. These rituals were performed with the belief that if a person had been a vampire in life, their body would show certain signs, such as an unusually high amount of blood in the corpse, a bloated appearance, or a body that seemed unnaturally well preserved. The fear of vampires became so pervasive that even minor physical anomalies in the dead were often interpreted as signs of vampirism, leading to widespread panic and violent practices aimed at protecting the living. Vampire folklore, however, was not uniform across Europe. In some regions, the vampire was seen as a revenant, a returned dead person who sought vengeance for some wrong. In these versions of the myth, vampires were often not inherently evil, but were driven by a need to exact justice or right the wrongs they had suffered in life. These vampires were thought to be the spirits of people who had been wronged or who had died in violent, untimely deaths. For example, in Slavic mythology, the vampire might be a person who had been unjustly murdered or who had been betrayed in life. Their return from the grave was seen as a form of retribution, and their haunting of the living was framed as an attempt to bring balance to an unjust world. In other variations of the vampire myth, the creature was more of a mindless, predatory entity, a monstrous, ravenous creature that had no interest in seeking justice, but was driven only by the need to feed. This version of the vampire was a terrifying, soulless being that would drain the blood of the living to sustain its own unnatural existence. The idea that a vampire could turn others into vampires through the act of blood drinking, creating a chain of the undead, was a critical aspect of the myth. In this sense, the vampire was not just an isolated monster. It was a spreading plague, a contagion that could decimate entire communities if left unchecked. The Church, with its powerful influence over medieval European society, played a significant role in shaping the vampire myth. In many cases, the Church's teachings were used to explain and reinforce the existence of vampires. Christianity, which taught that the soul was immortal and that the afterlife was determined by one's faith and deeds in life, saw the vampire as a particularly abominable entity. The vampire was considered a creature that existed outside the natural order of life and death. To the Church, the vampire represented a challenge to divine power, a being that defied the natural cycle of death and resurrection, as taught in Christian doctrine. The idea that a dead person could return to life, unbidden and unholy, was seen as a direct affront to God's will. The medieval Church also played a central role in combating the vampire threat. Religious rituals, prayers, and holy symbols were often used to ward off vampires. In some cases, it was believed that the mere presence of a cross or other sacred objects would repel a vampire, preventing it from attacking or entering sacred spaces. These rituals were designed not just to protect the living, but to ensure that the dead were properly laid to rest and would not rise again. The fear of vampires and their ability to disrupt the natural order of life and death became deeply tied to the Church's role in maintaining spiritual and social order. The vampire legend evolved over time, and as the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and beyond, the vampire became a more refined and romanticized figure in literature and culture. However, its origins as a creature of fear, born from the medieval anxieties about death, disease, and the supernatural, remain at the heart of the myth. The vampire, in its original form, was a symbol of death's unpredictability, a being that came from the grave to prey on the living. It was a creature of chaos, disrupting the boundaries between life and death, the natural and the supernatural, and the human and the monstrous. The fear of vampires in medieval Europe was not just a matter of belief in the supernatural, but also reflected the broader anxieties of the time. Life in the medieval period was unpredictable and often violent. Death was an ever-present reality, and the uncertainty of what came after death was a source of great fear. The idea that the dead could return as vampires added another layer of terror to a world that was already marked by disease, famine, and war. The vampire myth, with its roots in fear, death, and the unknown, became one of the most enduring and terrifying legends of the medieval period. Even today, the vampire continues to haunt our imaginations, serving as a reminder of the deep-seated fears that once gripped the people of medieval Europe. In the medieval world, few fears were as deeply rooted in the collective psyche as that of werewolves. Unlike other supernatural creatures that were bound to specific traditions or beliefs, the werewolf mythos seemed to transcend cultural boundaries, making its mark in regions as diverse as France, Germany, Scandinavia, and even Eastern Europe. The concept of the werewolf, the human transformed into a wolf or something wolf-like, spoke to a primal fear that resonated deeply with medieval societies. This fear was not only that a man turned beast, but also the darker aspect of human nature that could be unleashed in a moment of rage, desperation, or terror. The werewolf was a terrifying symbol of the thin line between humanity and monstrosity, civilization and savagery that haunted the medieval imagination. But the fear of werewolves was not just mythological or folkloric concept. It was rooted in genuine societal anxiety, often fueled by ignorance, superstition, and the harsh realities of medieval life. The origins of the werewolf legend in the medieval period are complex and multifaceted, drawing from ancient beliefs in shape-shifting and animal transformations. In many ways, the werewolf served as a reflection of humanity's darkest impulses, the part of the human psyche that was governed by instincts, violence, and the uncontrollable forces of nature. It was not uncommon for medieval people to believe that certain individuals had the ability to transform into animals, particularly wolves. Wolves, as apex predators in many parts of Europe, were already feared for their ferocity, cunning, and ability to hunt in packs. To associate humans with wolves was to suggest that a person could become something both alien and terrifying, an apex predator with no moral compass or societal constraints. But this belief also spoke to something deeper, something psychological. The idea that beneath the veneer of civilization, there lay a darker, more savage side of humanity that could emerge at any moment. The fear of werewolves was further fueled by the Christian worldview that dominated medieval Europe. The idea that humans could be possessed or transformed by evil forces was a prevalent belief during this time. Werewolves were often seen as individuals who had made pacts with the devil, surrendering their human nature in exchange for power or the ability to transform. This was a particularly potent fear in a society that believed in the constant battle between good and evil, where the devil was an ever-present and dangerous force. The notion of a human being so thoroughly corrupted by evil that they could no longer be considered human, that they could become something monstrous, was a terrifying thought. Werewolves, in this context, were believed to be agents of Satan, cursed beings who had lost their souls and humanity in the process of their transformation. It was said that they could not control their urges, that they were driven by a compulsion to hunt, kill, and destroy. The werewolf was often portrayed as a savage killer, a creature that would go on rampages, tearing apart livestock, hunting down humans, and causing destruction wherever it went. This bloodlust, combined with the wolf's predatory nature, made the werewolf a particularly fearsome figure. Stories and accounts of werewolf attacks began to circulate, particularly in rural areas where the boundaries between human civilization and the wild world of nature were often blurred. These stories were often exaggerated, fueled by local superstition, and colored by the harsh realities of medieval life. Wolves, as real animals, were responsible for killing livestock and sometimes even attacking humans, particularly in areas where hunger and scarcity were common. In these conditions, it was easy for people to link these real-life predations with the fear of the supernatural. A person could become a werewolf in the same way that someone could become possessed, through sin, pacts with the devil, or the intervention of dark forces. One of the most chilling aspects of the werewolf myth was its link to human behavior. The transformation was not just physical. It was often portrayed as a complete shift in personality and morality. The werewolf was not simply an animal in the body of a man. It was a man who had lost all trace of humanity. The idea that a person could be transformed into a mindless, bloodthirsty creature spoke to the medieval fear of the loss of control, of the breakdown of the self. In many werewolf legends, the transformation was involuntary. The person would have no memory of their actions in their wolf form, which added a terrifying layer of ambiguity. Could someone, without realizing it, become a killer? Werewolves were often seen as tragic figures, people who were not inherently evil but had been cursed, whether by their own actions or by dark forces beyond their control. This made the werewolf a figure of both horror and sympathy, a creature that was simultaneously human and animal, good and evil. The medieval church, in its efforts to maintain spiritual and moral order, took a strong stance against a belief in werewolves. The church saw the idea of werewolves as a dangerous superstition, one that could undermine the authority of Christian teachings. It viewed the werewolf as a manifestation of the devil's power, a sign of the corruption of the human soul. In many cases, the church sought to root out werewolves and those who believed in them, branding them as heretics, witches, or servants of Satan. This religious persecution of those accused of being werewolves was, in many ways, an extension of the witch hunts that were happening throughout Europe. People believed that the werewolf was not just a myth but a real threat, and accusations of lycanthropy, the condition of being a werewolf, could lead to extreme and violent consequences. Trials and executions of suspected werewolves were not uncommon in medieval Europe, particularly in France and Germany, where the belief in werewolves was widespread. The trials of werewolves were often similar to those of witches, with the accused subjected to torture in order to extract confessions. Like witches, those accused of being werewolves were often seen as agents of evil, who had entered into pacts with the devil and used their powers to cause harm. The most famous example of werewolf trials took place in the early 16th century in the region of Alsace, France. Between 1520 and 1630, dozens of people were accused of being werewolves and were executed in brutal ways. The most notorious case was that of the werewolf of Poligny, a man named Jean Grenier, who was accused of being a werewolf and later confessed to his crimes under duress. Grenier claimed to have killed and eaten numerous children while in his wolf form, and his confession, along with the testimony of witnesses, led to his execution. While it is clear that Jean Grenier's confession was likely obtained through torture, his case exemplified the extreme fear and panic that surrounded the idea of werewolves during the medieval period. The fear of werewolves was not just a medieval phenomenon. It persisted into the early modern period, though it began to take on a different character as Europe became more familiar with rationalism, science, and the rise of modernity. By the 18th century, the belief in werewolves had largely diminished in many parts of Europe, as the Enlightenment ushered in a new era of reason and skepticism. Yet, the legacy of the werewolf myth continued to resonate in popular culture, particularly in literature and folklore. Stories of werewolves were transformed, taking on new layers of symbolism, often reflecting the anxieties of the time. The werewolf continued to appear in literature, especially in Gothic fiction, where it took on new meanings. It became a symbol of the dangers of repressed desires, the fear of the unknown, and the darkness that could lurk within the human soul. The werewolf, once seen as a simple monster, evolved into a complex figure, embodying the duality of human nature, both civilized and savage, rational and irrational. In this sense, the werewolf became more than just a supernatural creature. It became a metaphor for the darker impulses that lay hidden within all human beings. The tension between the human and the beast, between society and the wild, remained a central theme in these later interpretations of the werewolf myth. Even today, the figure of the werewolf persists in modern culture, although it has been largely detached from its medieval roots. In contemporary times, werewolves are often portrayed in popular media as tragic antiheroes, misunderstood creatures struggling to control their monstrous nature. The modern werewolf, however, still carries with it the primal fear that was present in the medieval period. The fear of transformation, the fear of losing one's humanity, and the fear of the wild forces that lurk just beyond the boundaries of civilization. The werewolf myth, at its core, taps into deep-seated human fears about identity, control, and the power of the primal instincts that lie beneath the surface. In medieval times, these fears were very real, shaped by the harshness of life and the ever-present threat of death. The werewolf represented the ultimate loss of control, the terrifying possibility that one's humanity could be erased, leaving behind only the savage beast. The medieval fear of the werewolf was not merely a superstition, but a reflection of the anxieties and dangers of a world that was still struggling to understand the forces of nature and the complexities of a human soul. During the medieval period, the concept of the undead was not limited to vampires and werewolves. Another terrifying manifestation of death that haunted the medieval imagination was the belief in the revenant, a type of restless spirit or corpse that would return from the grave to haunt the living. This figure, often considered the ultimate manifestation of death gone awry, symbolized not only a fear of the afterlife, but also profound unease with the natural order of life and death. The revenant was a creature that defied both human understanding and the divine order, returning from death in a grotesque form, often bent on revenge, or simply to torment those it had left behind. Its presence in medieval folklore and legend spoke to the deep-seated anxieties surrounding death, the afterlife, and the possibilities of what might occur when death was not properly respected. The revenant was typically imagined as a corpse that had not fully decayed or a spirit that had returned to wreak havoc on the living. In some cases, these revenants were believed to have been individuals who had died violently, prematurely, or unjustly, and as a result, their souls were not at peace. This disturbance of the natural cycle of life and death was seen as an affront to the divine order, and in many medieval tales, the revenant was viewed as a punishment or a warning. The revenant's return was an omen, a symbol that something had gone wrong in the natural world, and it was often tied to a sense of moral reckoning. Revenants were typically associated with a variety of disturbing traits. They were often described as pale, bloated corpses with a ghastly, decayed appearance, yet somehow animated. In some accounts, the revenant would appear to be fully alive, though clearly something was terribly wrong. These undead beings were not only frightening in their appearance, but they also exhibited unnatural strength and viciousness, as though their return to the world of the living had come at the cost of their humanity. They were sometimes portrayed as having a relentless thirst for blood, a desire to drain the life force of the living, but other times they were driven by an insatiable hunger for vengeance. The revenant's presence was marked by a sense of decay, both physical and spiritual. As it moved through the world of the living, it brought with it a sickness or blight, as if it were a physical manifestation of the curse that had caused its return. The reasons for a revenant's return were as varied as the tales themselves. In some stories, the revenant was the spirit of a person who had been murdered or wronged in life. Their return was seen as an act of vengeance, meant to seek justice for the wrongs done to them. In these cases, the revenant would often seek out the person or people responsible for their death and exact a brutal punishment. These revenants were driven by a sense of injustice, an unfulfilled need for retribution, and their return was seen as a final judgment that had been denied them in life. For those who had wronged them, the revenant's return was an inescapable reckoning, a reminder that no sin, no matter how long buried, would remain unpunished. In other cases, the revenant was a result of improper burial rituals. In medieval Europe, death was considered a transition between the physical and spiritual worlds, and there were specific rites and rituals meant to ensure that the soul could peacefully pass on to the afterlife. If these rituals were neglected, or if the body was not properly prepared for burial, it was believed that the soul could become trapped in the physical world, manifesting as a revenant. The fear of improper burial was not just a superstition, but a deeply held belief in the medieval world. Corpses that were not properly interred, or those that had been disturbed in their graves, were thought to pose a serious threat to the living, as they were seen as carrying with them the weight of unresolved issues or curses. The revenant was not always a malevolent spirit. In some stories, the revenant was driven by an unfulfilled obligation or a desire to complete something left undone in life. This was particularly common in stories involving people who had died before their time or had left important matters unresolved. In these cases, the revenant's return was less about vengeance and more about the need for closure. These revenants were often depicted as seeking to complete unfinished business or to deliver a final message to the living. Their presence was not always terrifying, but it still carried with it a sense of unease, as it was a reminder that death had not put an end to everything. It had merely created a new chapter, one that defied the natural order. The revenant impact on the living was often depicted as a source of fear and chaos. Its return would throw the world into disarray, disrupting the peaceful passage of time and causing great harm. In some cases, the revenant was seen as a force of nature, an unstoppable entity that could not be reasoned with or turned away. Its very presence suggested that something had gone wrong in the world of the living, and its actions, while sometimes justified by vengeance, were nonetheless terrifying. The revenant's return was a violent and unsettling interruption of the natural order. It was a reminder that death was not always final, that the line between the living and the dead was not always clear, and that sometimes the dead had unfinished business that could not be ignored. The revenant also served as a reflection of medieval fears surrounding the afterlife. In a time when Christian teachings about life after death were central to the worldview, the idea that the dead could return to life was deeply unsettling. It suggested that the afterlife was not as certain or as controlled as it was thought to be. The revenant was not a soul peacefully moving on to its final resting place. It was a soul that had been disturbed, prevented from achieving its proper rest. This fear of disturbed souls spoke to the uncertainty surrounding death and the afterlife. For medieval people, death was a great unknown, a transition that could be fraught with danger. The revenant was a manifestation of that uncertainty, a reminder that the afterlife might not be a peaceful journey, but a place where souls could be trapped, lost, or even resurrected to wreak havoc on the living. The fear of the revenant was often tied to societal structures and practices surrounding death. As medieval societies were deeply religious and governed by strict codes of conduct, the idea of a revenant returning to seek vengeance or exact justice was also a reflection of the importance of moral behavior and social order. A revenant was, in many ways, a punishment for improper conduct, whether in life, in death, or in the handling of the dead. If the living had failed to respect the dead, or had failed to follow the proper rites and rituals, they were thought to be inviting disaster. The revenant served as a warning that the consequences of neglect or sin could come back to haunt them in ways they never expected. As with many other supernatural beliefs of the medieval period, the revenant myth was closely tied to communities' understanding of life and death. Medieval people lived in a world where death was ever present, whether from disease, famine, war, or other causes. Life was often short, and the afterlife was uncertain. In such an environment, it was easy for the line between life and death to become blurred, for death to become something that was not always final, but instead something that could return to haunt the living. The revenant, as a creature that came from the grave, was the embodiment of this blurred boundary. It was not just a symbol of death, but a manifestation of fear that death could be interrupted, that the dead could return to the living world and demand retribution or reconciliation. In later centuries, as the medieval worldview began to fade and give way to the Renaissance and Enlightenment, the belief in revenants began to wane. As scientific understanding of death and disease advanced, the supernatural explanations for restless spirits became less convincing. However, the revenant myth did not completely disappear. It persisted in folklore and literature, where it evolved into various forms, sometimes appearing as ghosts, sometimes as creatures of darkness that had lost their humanity. Even in modern times, the revenant remains a popular figure in horror fiction, a symbol of the unresolved and the uncanny, representing the fear that death is not always an end, and that the dead may return when least expected. The revenant's enduring presence in both historical and modern storytelling speaks to the powerful and universal fear of death and the unknown. Its return from the grave is a reminder that the boundaries between life and death are not always as solid as we might wish them to be, and that sometimes even death itself is not enough to put an end to the terror that it brings. The medieval period was a time of great upheaval, uncertainty, and fear, with one of the most pervasive terrors being the specter of demons. The belief in demons was not only a deeply ingrained religious and spiritual reality, but also a profound manifestation of the medieval mind's fear of the unknown, the unholy, and the uncontrollable forces of nature and the supernatural. These demons were not mere figments of imagination or symbolic representations of evil. In the medieval world, they were believed to be real, malevolent beings that had the power to corrupt, possess, and destroy. They could be summoned, controlled, or driven out through rituals, but their very presence was seen as an ominous threat to both the soul and the body. The concept of demons in medieval Europe was deeply influenced by religious teachings, particularly those of the Christian Church, which viewed demons as agents of Satan, sent to tempt, corrupt, and lead humans away from God. The devil was seen as the ultimate source of evil, and his minions, the demons, were believed to carry out his will on earth. These demons were not just faceless, abstract representations of evil. They were often depicted as tangible entities with specific forms, personalities, and goals. Some demons were believed to be agents of temptation, enticing people to sin through lust, greed, or envy. Others were seen as destroyers, capable of wreaking havoc on both the body and the spirit. But all demons shared a common goal: to undermine the divine order and lead souls to damnation. The most frightening aspect of the medieval conception of demons was their power to possess human beings. Possession was seen as a terrifying and complete takeover of an individual's body and soul, an act in which the demon would literally inhabit the person, controlling their thoughts, actions, and desires. Possession was often portrayed as an external manifestation of the inner corruption of the soul, a sign that the individual had been overcome by evil forces and had lost their connection to God. In many cases, possession was believed to be caused by sin, either committed by the individual or by their ancestors. The concept of inherited sin, passed down through generations, was a powerful motivator for many medieval fears. If a person's family had sinned or made a pact with the devil, that person could be vulnerable to demonic possession. The signs of demonic possession were believed to be obvious and unmistakable. The possessed individual would exhibit strange and unnatural behaviors, such as speaking in languages they had never learned, displaying superhuman strength, or engaging in acts of self-mutilation. The possessed person might also exhibit a complete change in personality, displaying violent or malicious tendencies that were completely out of character. The voice of the possessed person was said to change, sometimes becoming guttural or inhuman, as though it were no longer their own. In some cases, it was believed that the possessed individual could perform feats that were impossible for ordinary people, such as levitation or contorting their body in unnatural ways. These signs were seen as irrefutable proof that the individual had been taken over by a demon, and the only solution was to drive the demon out through exorcism. Exorcism was a central ritual in the medieval battle against demons. The Catholic Church, in particular, was deeply involved in the practice of exorcism, believing that only a priest with the proper training and authority could effectively expel demons from the possessed. The ritual of exorcism was a complex and often painful process, involving prayers, chants, the use of holy water, and the invocation of the power of Christ to force the demon to depart. In some cases, the exorcism could last for days or even weeks, with the priest struggling to free the victim from the demon's grip. It was believed that the demon would fight back, resisting the exorcist's efforts, and that the person being possessed would suffer extreme physical and mental torment as the demon was driven out. The process was not only seen as a physical battle, but also a spiritual one, in which the very soul of the possessed person was at stake. The medieval understanding of demons also included belief in their ability to shapeshift and take on various forms. Demons were not bound to any single appearance, and they could appear in many different guises, from the terrifying to the seductive. The classic image of a demon as a grotesque, horned creature with sharp teeth and claws was just one of many representations. Some demons were believed to appear as beautiful women or handsome men, luring their victims into temptation and sin. Others were said to take on the form of animals, particularly snakes or wolves, creatures that had long been associated with evil and darkness. The ability to change form was seen as one of the demon's most dangerous powers, as it allowed them to manipulate, deceive, and control people in ways that were difficult to detect. Another terrifying aspect of the medieval belief in demons was their perceived influence over natural events. Demons were often blamed for disasters such as plagues, famines, and storms. In an age when the causes of disease were not well understood, outbreaks of illness were frequently attributed to demonic influence. The idea that demons could cause physical suffering by affecting the body was a powerful and pervasive fear. In some cases, people believed that demons could cause not only disease but also death, bringing their victims to an untimely end as part of their malevolent agenda. This connection between demons and physical illness contributed to the widespread belief that demons were responsible for the many natural calamities that befell medieval communities. The belief in demons was not limited to religious or spiritual circles. It permeated every level of medieval society. The fear of demonic possession and influence was so pervasive that it was not uncommon for ordinary people to perform their own rituals to protect themselves from demonic forces. Amulets, charms, and protective symbols were widely used to ward off evil, and many people turned to folk remedies, spells, and incantations in an attempt to shield themselves from the demonic realm. In some cases, entire communities would band together to perform rituals aimed at keeping demons at bay, often through the use of holy objects such as relics or the bones of saints. These practices, while not officially sanctioned by the church, reflected the widespread fear that demons were constantly lurking just out of sight, ready to strike at any moment. The fear of demons was also deeply connected to the concept of witchcraft, which was a particularly potent source of terror during the medieval period. Witches were often believed to be in league with demons, using dark magic to summon and control evil spirits. The idea that witches could communicate with demons, make pacts with them, or even become possessed by them was central to the medieval conception of witchcraft. Witches were seen as being able to manipulate the natural world through the use of demons, calling on these evil spirits to do their bidding. This connection between witches and demons fueled the hysteria surrounding the witch hunts that swept across Europe, with thousands of people, particularly women, being accused of consorting with demons and engaging in dark, forbidden magic. The idea that witches could be possessed by demons or that demons could take control of their bodies made the fear of witches even more terrifying. The idea of demons and their influence persisted throughout the medieval period, though the role of the church in combating them began to evolve as the centuries passed. By the time of the Renaissance, the belief in demons had become more secularized in many parts of Europe, with demons being viewed more as a metaphor for internal human struggles rather than as actual supernatural beings. However, the legacy of the medieval fear of demons still had profound impact on later cultures, particularly in literature and folklore. The image of the demon as a dark and malevolent force continued to shape the way evil was conceptualized in the Western world, evolving into more familiar figures seen in Gothic fiction and modern horror. Even today, the legacy of the medieval belief in demons continues to resonate in various aspects of culture. The idea of demonic possession, in particular, remains a potent symbol of the struggle between good and evil, often depicted in films, books, and other forms of media. While modern science and rationalism have largely dispelled the supernatural aspects of these beliefs, the psychological and cultural impact of the fear of demons remains. The demons of the medieval period were not just creatures of terror. They were also reflections of the anxieties and uncertainties of the time. They embodied the fear of the unknown, the fear of corruption and moral decay, and the fear of losing control over one's soul. And in many ways, the fear of demons that haunted the medieval mind still haunts us today, lurking in the darker corners of our collective consciousness. In the tapestry of medieval fears and folklore, there was a legend that persisted across cultures and regions, spreading from the icy landscapes of the north to the dark corners of Central and Eastern Europe. The legend of the witch. Witches were not merely figures of superstition in the medieval world. They were perceived as powerful, dangerous beings who had the ability to alter the natural order of things, often at the behest of dark forces. The fear of witches was as pervasive as it was potent, woven into the fabric of medieval life by a mixture of religious beliefs, societal anxieties, and a desire for control in a chaotic and often brutal world. Witches were believed to possess the knowledge and the power to harness the supernatural, to communicate with demons, and to bring forth curses and calamities. This belief in witches created a dangerous and terrifying reality for those accused of practicing witchcraft, leading to a witch hunt hysteria that would result in some of the darkest chapters in European history. The medieval understanding of witches was shaped by the intersection of two key forces, religion and folklore. Christianity, which dominated medieval Europe, brought with it a rigid worldview that saw the world in stark terms of good versus evil, light versus darkness. Within this framework, witches were viewed as servants of the devil, those who had made pacts with Satan to gain power in exchange for their souls. The church's teachings emphasized the danger of witchcraft, and in the eyes of the clergy, witches were seen as enemies of God. This connection between witches and the devil was deeply ingrained in the medieval imagination, making accusations of witchcraft not only a matter of religious concern, but also a moral and social one. Witchcraft was often linked to the idea of maleficium or harmful magic. Witches were believed to have the ability to cast spells that could cause sickness, death, or misfortune, either through curses or by using potions and enchanted objects. The medieval belief in the power of witches to bring about such harm was not just a product of superstition, but was rooted in the lived realities of medieval life. Disease, famine, crop failure, and other misfortunes were often seen as punishment from God or the work of evil forces. When calamity struck a community, it was common for people to look for scapegoats, and witches, with their mysterious powers and secretive ways, became easy targets. A single bad harvest or a sudden outbreak of illness could lead to accusations of witchcraft, particularly if someone was known to be an outsider or someone whose behavior was considered suspicious or eccentric. The church's stance on witchcraft further intensified these fears. In the early medieval period, the church had a more lenient view toward folk magic, seeing it as a lesser form of superstition. However, by the 12th century, as the power of the church grew, so too did its efforts to combat what it saw as the dangers of heresy and sorcery. The church began to preach that witchcraft was not simply a form of petty magic, but a direct affront to God, a denial of Christ and his divine power. This shift in thinking transformed the witch from a solitary figure engaged in harmless or benign magical practices to a dangerous threat, someone who had made an unholy pact with Satan and was actively working to subvert the Christian order. The belief that witches had the power to harm or kill through magic, coupled with the idea that they were in league with the devil, created a potent combination of fear, hatred, and suspicion. The fear of witches took on even greater urgency during times of social and political instability, in periods of war, plague, or famine. When the stability of society was threatened, people became more susceptible to scapegoating. Accusations of witchcraft often flourished in these times, as individuals and communities sought to explain their misfortunes. Witches were believed to be capable of causing such misfortunes at will, using dark powers to destroy crops, cause sickness, or even kill. The vulnerability of medieval people to these fears was compounded by the lack of scientific understanding. Disease outbreaks, such as the Black Death, would devastate communities, and in the absence of medical knowledge, supernatural explanations were readily embraced. Witches were blamed for these disasters, further deepening the public's fear and distrust of those accused of witchcraft. The witch hunt hysteria reached its apex in the late medieval and early modern periods, particularly in the 15th and 16th centuries, when the belief in witches and their connection to Satan led to widespread trials and executions. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, a treatise published in 1487 by two inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, played a crucial role in inciting these witch hunts. The Hammer of Witches, as it was known, was a manual for the identification, prosecution, and punishment of witches. It was a chillingly detailed account of the supposed activities of witches and included instructions on how to identify them, how to extract confessions through torture, and how to conduct trials. The Malleus Maleficarum had a profound impact on the spread of witch hunt mania, as it legitimized the idea that witches were not only real but also dangerous, and that they needed to be eradicated from society. The witch trials that followed were brutal and horrific. Thousands of people, most of them women, were accused of witchcraft and subjected to trials that were often little more than acts of torture and execution. The methods used to identify witches were cruel and barbaric. One of the most notorious techniques was the swimming test, in which a person accused of witchcraft was thrown into water. If they floated, they were deemed guilty of witchcraft, as it was believed that water, being a pure element, would reject the wicked. If they sank, they were considered innocent, though they would likely drown. In addition to drowning, witches were often burned at the stake, a gruesome form of execution designed not only to punish but to purify the soul. The witch trials were a dark chapter in medieval history, one marked by fear, ignorance, and superstition. The hysteria surrounding witchcraft reflected the fragility of medieval society, where the unknown was often perceived as evil, and those who deviated from societal norms were viewed with suspicion. Women, in particular, were the primary targets of witch hunts. This was partly because medieval society had rigid gender roles, and women who did not conform to expectations, whether through their social behavior, marital status, or eccentricities, were often seen as outcasts, vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. Many of the accused were older women, widows, or those living alone, people who were easily marginalized and scapegoated. The fear of witches also had a profound impact on the development of legal systems in medieval Europe. The widespread belief in witchcraft led to the establishment of special courts and tribunals dedicated solely to the prosecution of witches. The legal process was often a farce, with little regard for evidence or justice. Confessions were frequently extracted under duress, through torture, or by the threat of death. In some cases, accused witches were forced to name others, creating a chain of accusations that spiraled out of control. The trials became a tool for maintaining power and control, with both the church and the secular authorities using witch hunts to assert their authority over communities and individuals. The consequences of the witch hunts were devastating. Thousands of innocent people were executed, and entire communities were left in fear of being accused of witchcraft. The legacy of the witch trials continues to resonate today, as the idea of witches has been shaped and reshaped in various ways throughout history, from the terrifying figures of medieval folklore to the more modern interpretations seen in literature, film, and pop culture. The belief in witches persisted beyond the medieval period, but by the Enlightenment, the influence of reason and scientific inquiry began to undermine these superstitions. The rise of rational thought, along with advancements in medicine and psychology, gradually shifted public perception, and the witch hunt slowed. However, the legacy of the witch's image as a powerful, mysterious figure has endured, continuing to capture the collective imagination. In modern times, the witch has evolved into a symbol of empowerment, independence, and rebellion against societal norms, especially in contemporary feminist and occult movements. The witch's image has shifted from that of a malevolent force to a symbol of resistance, reclaiming the power that was once used against her. Yet, the fear of the witch remains part of the cultural landscape, a reminder of a time when superstition and fear governed the lives of the innocent. The witch, once a figure of terror, now stands as a symbol of resilience and the enduring power of myth in shaping human history and culture. The medieval period, rife with tales of spectral apparitions and supernatural horrors, was marked by an overwhelming belief in the malevolent power of ghosts. Unlike modern views of ghosts, which often view them as harmless or even comforting entities, the medieval conception of ghosts was one of fear, dread, and uncertainty. Ghosts were seen not as the souls of loved ones returned to offer guidance or closure, but as restless, dangerous spirits capable of wreaking havoc on the living. These apparitions were believed to be manifestations of souls trapped between the realms of the living and the dead, cursed to wander the earth due to improper burial, violent death, or unresolved injustices. The fear of ghosts was deeply intertwined with the medieval understanding of sin, justice, and the afterlife. The belief in the restless dead was a pervasive feature of medieval folklore, reflecting the anxieties of society living in constant fear of the unknown, of divine retribution, and of a world that was beyond human control. Medieval people viewed the dead not as passive entities, but as active forces that could intervene in the lives of the living. Ghosts were often seen as malevolent beings, capable of causing illness, misfortune, or even death. They were believed to haunt specific locations, such as graveyards, abandoned buildings, or battlefields, where they were thought to be tied to a traumatic event or an unresolved conflict. Ghosts were particularly associated with violent or untimely deaths, such as murder, suicide, or death in battle, where the soul was believed to have been denied a peaceful transition into the afterlife. These spirits in the medieval mindset were not at rest. Their unfinished business or unfulfilled vengeance kept them bound to the mortal world, and they would not find peace until their issues were resolved. The Church, as the ultimate authority on matters of the afterlife, played a significant role in shaping medieval beliefs about ghosts. It taught that the soul would be judged after death and that a person's fate would be determined by their deeds in life. However, for many medieval people, the concept of judgment was not always comforting. The idea that the soul might become a restless spirit if it was not properly judged or if it had not undergone the necessary rituals for salvation created widespread fear. If a person died without receiving proper last rites, or if their body was not buried in consecrated ground, they were believed to be at risk of becoming a ghost. This fear of improperly dealt with souls extended to belief that some individuals could be denied eternal rest due to sin or a curse. The idea that some souls could be trapped on earth, unable to ascend to heaven or descend to hell, reinforced the medieval sense of divine and supernatural power being intertwined with human fate. In addition to the religious context, the belief in ghosts was also shaped by the harsh and uncertain conditions of medieval life. In an era where disease, famine, and war were common, people were accustomed to living with the ever-present threat of death. Mortality was high, and many lives were lost suddenly or violently. In such a world, the line between life and death was often seen as fluid, and death itself was not always an end but a transformation, one that could be unnatural or disturbing. The medieval world was full of signs and omens, and death, especially a sudden or violent one, was often viewed as a harbinger of something greater or more terrifying. Ghosts, as supernatural entities, were seen as a reflection of this uncertainty. If death could strike unexpectedly and cruelly, who could say that the dead were truly gone? Who could say that the living were safe from the intervention of those who had passed? In medieval literature and chronicles, ghosts were frequently depicted as restless and vengeful spirits, often tormenting those who had wronged them in life. These spectral figures could appear in many forms, from a shadowy figure to a terrifying apparition with glowing eyes or outstretched hands. Ghosts were often described as having an eerie, oppressive presence, accompanied by strange noises, cold winds, or unexplained phenomena. The very atmosphere surrounding a ghostly encounter was believed to be charged with malevolent energy, unsettling those who came into contact with it. The ghost in these stories was not simply a benign visitation, but a creature of power and purpose, capable of causing real harm. Its actions were often seen as an expression of divine or karmic justice, as if the spirit had been sent back to exact punishment or to warn the living of their moral failings. One of the most terrifying aspects of ghosts in the medieval period was their ability to appear to the living in dreams, visions, or even physical form. In some stories, a ghost was believed to be able to communicate directly with the living, often to seek vengeance for a perceived wrong. These ghosts were sometimes described as coming in the dead of night, appearing at the foot of bed or in the shadows of a room. Their presence felt as a heavy weight pressing on the living. They would often speak in cryptic language or demand that a wrong be righted, providing instructions or warnings that could not be ignored. In many medieval ghost stories, the haunting would continue until the living took some action, such as making restitution for a wrong or fulfilling the ghost's final wishes. If these actions were not taken, the ghost would continue to torment the living, sometimes to the point of insanity or death.